Welcome to Election Watch. Today, Craig Stronberg joins the conversation on trade, AI, and all things geopolitical. Here are your hosts, Janice Mays and Rohit Kumar.
Great to see you, Janice, and welcome, Craig.
Thanks. You know I love doing this with you.
Good to see both.
Okay, before we get started, I wanted to note, Craig, that you are PwC's macro intelligence leader and heavily involved in analyzing geopolitical issues, which is why we wanted to speak with you about trade and AI. Now, first, if you put yourself in either of the candidates' shoes, what are the big challenges globally right now, and what would the candidate have to deal with if elected to office?
So one of the things that I think businesses will recognize is that there probably hasn't been a presidential election in a world that was this complicated to operate in since 2020, right? For a different set of reasons. But I think what is true for both candidates and what is true for businesses is that the global operating environment, because of macroeconomic and geopolitical pressures and changes, is extraordinarily volatile this year as it was 4 years ago. There's a few things that are making it that way that sort of grab the headlines, right? One of them is economic growth, which is probably a better story in the US, where growth is at least steady, if not steady plus, than most of the rest of the world, where it's either negative or steady minus. So this is something that we're going to hear a lot about because the economy matters so much to the campaign. But growth is going to be a key issue that's going to come up again and again. The other one that's going to come up a lot is going to be U.S.-China relations, not just because it's important to the U.S., but because it's important to countries and companies all over the world. And at the moment, U.S.-China relations are fairly stable. There is tension within the system, within the relationship. But there have been, for the last couple of years at least, a lot of joint visits, including the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury last week, that are making relations a little more predictable for business. But the health of that relationship is still a top priority for both candidates, and it's a top priority for businesses all over the world. I think the third one is Ukraine. And here you're probably going to see some divergence between how the candidates talk about this, how the campaigns may focus on this. But as we get towards November, we're starting to get towards the end of the year. And what it looks like on the ground in Ukraine could look very different in November than it does sitting here in spring. And that will undoubtedly have an impact on voters and the campaign. The other one that's going to sort of probably follow that path is going to be what's going to happen in the Middle East over the next couple of months. Right, there's been a lot of brinksmanship that has been played by a lot of countries in the region. And I think, as we've talked about on this before, there's been a lot of cooperation behind the scenes that is encouraging. And there's a lot of limitations that countries are putting on their own behavior that could keep that lid on things to a degree. But again, how this part of the world evolves between now and the election is going to be really important for both campaigns, for both candidates. I'd say what all of these things add up to is that there is a shift in global power that has been going on since the last presidential election, and even before that. And the U.S. is having to deal with how it uses its global power. And the most visible element of that power is the president. And so how these candidates deal with these four issues and others is going to matter in how U.S. power manifests and how it's recognized and how it impacts business.
Craig, how do you expect either of these candidates to address trade and AI issues come January and forward? Where do they overlap? Where do they diverge? Let's start with the overlap.
That's a good question, because I think there's probably more overlap than is at first understood, because so much of the attention, right, is given to how things are explained, not necessarily the policies that are behind. When you look at trade, for instance, there isn't much of a difference on a couple of factors. One of those factors is how both President Trump in his first term and President Biden in his current term look at trade with China and look at protectionist policy overall, right? The current administration has continued almost everything that the previous one did in terms of restrictions on trade with China, Chinese companies in the U.S., and how U.S. companies should be thinking about certain types of technological and manufacturing activities in China. The protectionist policies, which began to be strengthened under Trump, have continued to be strengthened under Biden. And so there isn't a lot of daylight there. And what that means for businesses is no matter who wins, you're probably not going to see a lot of divergence in the next administration on protectionism. You might see some on trade. We'll have to see what happens. But there is the potential that if President Trump returns to office, that what you could see is a restart of the trade war that all of us talked about on this program, right, so much a few years ago, that threw businesses for a loop in the US and globally. He's talked a lot about this, right? Nobody knows whether or not for sure he would actually pursue this course, but it is entirely possible. And businesses need to think about the possibility that if he does return, a trade could go from being something that is limited somewhat by DC to having a much heavier hand, especially when it comes to how DC trades with China. There is a lot of overlap to the limited degree that both of these candidates talk about AI policy. Neither one of them talks a lot about it because they want to pay attention to other areas. But both of them think that AI needs investment. Both of them think that the government needs to figure out what it's going to do with AI. The problem is there isn't always a lot of clarity. And I think one of the big questions, which I will take the liberty sort of posing to you, is how does Congress feel about all of this? Because I think before either candidate can really enunciate their policy, they're going to want some direction in law. And from a novice's point of view, it doesn't seem like there's a lot coming out of the Hill, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think in the trade area over these last years, Congress gave a lot of its authority away to the president, and they did that through statute. It's hard to take that back. But some of my answer in the trade world will depend on how unified the Congress is. Whichever party doesn't have the presidency is not going to necessarily like what the president does, even if their own party would have done something similar. China will color a lot of this and some other things that I think are universal in the way they think about them. But trade it's going to be difficult. And if Congress wants to take some of that power back, they're going to have to, quote, trade for it with the president to figure out how to get there. On AI, Congress is just way behind. You know, they've got a lot of catching up to do. They're probably decades behind at this point. And you have a few people thinking about it in Congress, but there is no unified position yet in the congressional world.
Yeah, I'd say the one thing on AI is because it's so new, at least as to Congress, it's new, and to most of the populations, it's new. It doesn't come with like inherent political baggage, like trade does, or so many of the other issues that we talk about. And I give Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer, credit. He has convened a series of briefings, all senators briefings, to get people, senators in particular, kind of more up to speed with what's going on. Because I think there's an acknowledgement that this is something that Congress needs to learn about quickly, and then figure out what, if any, role is Congress going to have in terms of lawmaking, or what are the regulators going to be up to. And to the extent that Congress wants to understand what the regulations are, they need to understand what is happening underneath. So there's at least not an inherent partisanship to this. That doesn't mean that we might not find our way there. So often we do, but at least we start from a position of we just need to learn more about this. And I think that's what Congress is doing, with maybe a hint of fear, right? There's a lot of doomsaying around this. Is this, going to be the end of humanity, all of that? I mean, Congress reads the papers just like we do. And so there's an element of I need to understand this thing, because at least some people are out there saying this will be the end of the world as we know it.
That's an outstanding answer. Thank you for giving it.
Thanks. All right, Craig, thanks for joining us. It was great to have you, and we hope to have you back in the very near future.
Thank you both.
All right, before we finish up here, Janice, I did want to ask you a question. It's been a while since we talked about the election proper. Is there anything that's happening over the next couple of weeks that you're paying particular attention to?
Well, we sort of think we know who our two primary candidates are in this context. So I'm looking at three things. Former President Trump, he's using his legal challenges to solidify his base. But what's he doing to expand that base? I think he needs to expand it, and I don't see him figuring that part out yet. President Biden, he's got to respond to those 2020 voters who aren't sure they want to vote anymore. They are no longer enthused. How's he going to keep them enthused? They're unhappy over inflation. It continues. They're unhappy over the conflict in the Middle East, climate issues. He's got to figure out how to broaden that group back and pull them back in again. And among the third-party candidates, I'm looking at Robert Kennedy. Is he able to get on the ballot in those battleground states where he could make a plus or minus difference for either candidate?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I'm looking at a couple different things, actually. So I'm looking at, obviously, President Trump's trial in New York. That's getting a lot of attention right now. And sort of he's using that, again, to solidify the base. But is it really going to help him reach out to the Haley voters who didn't vote for him in the primary? On the other side of the ledger, I'm seeing some improvement in President Biden's polling numbers sort of across the board. Although if you're sort of nervous about, if you're a Biden fan and you're nervous about his prospects, you're seeing some weakness with younger voters. You're seeing some weakness with minority voters. And that continues to be a point of some concern, right? So those are kind of the two big things that I'm sort of paying attention to sort of in the near term. And then, of course, we'll just sort of have to see, as you pointed out, maybe this is one place where we're both paying attention is, RFK Jr., where does he get on the ballot? And are those swing states and those states where, his presence on the ballot could be decisive in terms of, how those electoral votes are cast?
It remains interesting.
Yeah, all right. We are going to have to wrap it up for this episode of Election Watch. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to talking to you next time.